intention today is to hopefully stimulate you to think more about this issue of protecting the environment privately, and perhaps even to go out and have a look at the book. So, start off by referring back to some basic economics. And if you go back to any of the mainstream first-year economics textbooks, if you do see any mention of the environment in one of those basic macro books, it's usually in the chapter that focuses on market failure. So after we've done all the sort of basic markets and some macro, we get into these esoteric chapters which start to talk about the way that markets might fail, and concepts like public goods, externalities come into play. We might even in better texts start looking at why some of the externality and public good issues arise, and some of the texts will start talking about property rights and how ill-defined or ill-defended property rights give rise to these problems of public goods and externalities. But by and large, the conclusion that's drawn is to point to Adam Smith's rather arthritic hand, invisible or not, saying that, well, with environmental issues in place, if we rely on decentralised, market-based coordination of individuals' choices within society, we end up in a situation where we have misallocation of resources. And then the following logic to that is, well, the market won't work, therefore we've got to look to the government. And so this will be used as a justification for government provision of environmental public goods, government regulation of activities that cause negative externalities. The motto becomes, get the price right. This is the way that the standard economics textbook comes through. Really much a Pagovian approach. Get the price right, slap on a tax, and everything will be fine. But think about that in a little bit more depth, and we start to experience some turbulence. Okay, what is this nirvana that we're seeking when we're thinking about efficiency of provision? And it's defined by the traditional concept of Pareto optimality. And we then start to think, well, what is this Pareto optimality, and can any system actually deliver Pareto optimality? And usually what we see in the textbooks is reference back to conditions of perfect competition, giving rise to Pareto efficient outcomes. And of course, one of the primary assumptions made to structure the model of perfect competition is perfect information. And of course, no system can work because no system is able to ensure that that perfect information is available. Transaction costs are everywhere. We have fundamentally a lack of information. And indeed, when you think closely about the sort of social coordination problem that we're dealing with here in coordinating the choices being made about resource uses, then we have a fundamental lack of information, and indeed social coordination is all about trying to deal with this so-called knowledge problem. Perhaps not even overcoming, but dealing with the knowledge problem. So, what have we got? We've got, is that the right one? How can we just slip to the bottom one? Somehow we just made a magical, saved ourselves 45, 50 minutes and came up with that. So, the next step is to think, well, no system's going to do this properly, and indeed I'll put to you that government provision, the sort of conclusions that the textbooks come up with, indeed face the same sorts of knowledge problems that the decentralised market system, and Friedrich Hayek is very famous for his reference to the fatal conceit of government thinking that they do have the sort of information flows, and Hayek pointed to the slow and incomplete process of governments being able to get the information required, and indeed talks about the lack of personal motivation to amongst the bureaucrats and the politicians to get that information in place. So bottom line is that the incentives of government don't align very closely to those of society. And unfortunately, some of the major textbooks don't really point that out. So what have we got? We've got omnipotent failure. We've got market failure, but we've also got the government being unable to achieve the nirvana of greater efficiency. And the basic thrust of the book is towards the notion that we should in fact be looking to take advantage of all of the possible methods of social coordination that we have available to us, to look to both governments and markets to provide stimulation for the protection and provision of environmental goods, and also to try to use these methods to avoid the weaknesses of their alternatives. And because so much emphasis has been put on the government policy side of this, the government policy to try to protect the environment, the book is really aiming to look more closely at opportunities provided by the other side of the spectrum, the other end of the spectrum, to look at ways in which the decentralised market-based system of coordination of resource choices may be able to provide some improvement in resource allocation, not perfection, but improvement to the ways in which we allocate resources, scarce resources. So, the book. The book. I've come to sell the book, not to praise it, or do I come to praise the book and sell it as well? What we're trying to do here is to look at various ways in which the private sector has been, could be, engaged in nature protection. It's not a book designed to say the government's useless, we don't have anything to do with the government. Right? What we're trying to do here is to look across the spectrum. Consider this resource allocation processes as a spectrum between private and public, and try to look at ways in which we can manipulate the processes of resource allocation along that spectrum to better advantage. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the time that I have your attention is to go through some of the chapters of the book to perhaps give you some ideas as to where this sort of stuff can go. The first concept that I'll introduce you to is a concept that Terry Anderson, a colleague from the US, has introduced into the literature called Enviropreneurship. So this is the notion that, in fact, entrepreneurs can take advantage of situations which traditionally economics has regarded as being conditions of failure. So where there are either non-existent property rights or conditions of high transaction costs limiting the effectiveness of private sector engagement, rather than look at those as problems, look at them as opportunities. Opportunities involving unsatisfied demand. Right? Out there, because of these barriers to the market's formation, there is in fact opportunity because the demand that's out there is so far latent. So there's opportunities there. Opportunities where there are no rights defined to goods that have environmental benefits associated with them. Are there ways in which perhaps agreements can be negotiated amongst the parties to ensure that there is effectively a quotient deal available so that gains can be achieved to both parties? Terry talks about cases where parties have engaged in opportunities to reduce effluent flows into waterways. One example he uses is in New Zealand, where dairy farmers are actually paid by producers of shellfish in an estuary to reduce their effluent discharges from principally dairy farms. So no government involvement. This is just an opportunity for an entrepreneurial shellfish producer seeing that the benefits that he can achieve through lowering effluent levels in the area where he's harvesting the shellfish are greater than the costs of paying off people upstream to lower their effluent discharges. And where there are rights defined, are there possibilities for an enviropreneur to come in and repackage the defined property rights into bundles that are more attractive to the market? And he uses the case of Beartooth Capital, a profit-making enterprise in the US, which basically goes into the real estate business, purchases farmland, it's come onto the market, and then it basically repackages the farmland so as to provide a different product. It no longer is farmland, it becomes habitat land. It becomes, particularly in the US, land that's attractive for hunting and fishing. So repackaging what's there as a defined property right into something that has a market for environmental purposes becomes viable. This is a lovely little logo that Beartooth Capital has on its website. Spends the money to buy the property, redevelops it, so it might mean some actual earth-moving works, restructuring creeks, putting together replanting of forests, restocking it with game animals, and then selling it back into the market. And the hope is, of course, that there's an increase in the price. Now, Beartooth Capital isn't alone in the world of this. In fact, there are examples in both Australia and New Zealand of not-for-profits that do this. Trust for Nature goes into the market and has been highly successful financially because it's been able to repackage bundles of land and sell it to a different clientele, a different sort of demand. And the QE2 Trust in New Zealand has also done that. And it's taken advantage of generally rising property prices. That hasn't hurt, but it's also this notion of being able to repackage the good that's important. Okay, so that's one sort of enviropreneur. The second chapter that I'll talk about is written by Michael Rolls, who's a South African. He talks about markets for biodiversity. And in particular, he talks about the market for the white rhino in South Africa. Now, we probably all know the story, the basic story about rhinos being subject to poaching, such that the numbers of white rhino in the wild suffered a tremendous decline. The classic way in which that poaching problem has been handled, as seen in countries like Kenya and Tanzania, has generally been the heavy-handed government trying to come down with soldiers to protect the rhino herds. Singularly unsuccessful. Hasn't really put much of a dent into the poaching game. In South Africa, there's been a slightly different approach. In fact, this Theft of Game Act was introduced into law in South Africa, and it gave rights to individuals to own rhino, to own all sorts of game animals. And what that did, and furthermore, not only could you own it, but you could trade these game animals. So what that did was to stimulate enterprises which focused on the breeding and protection of particularly the white rhino. Now, what was behind the stimulus? The stimulus was basically trophy hunting. So people willing to pay large amounts of money, seriously large amounts of money, to come in and shoot a rhino, stimulated the business of breeding the rhinos and so save the species. So if you like, the sacrifice of some for the greater good. All sorts of interesting potential out of that. If you think about what was happening with Beartooth Capital in the US, it was predominantly the hunting fishing story that drove that market. Here, it's the trophy hunting market that's driving the live rhino trade. Currently now, 25% of the remaining herd of white rhino are on private land in these reserves being bred for trophy hunters. some serious issues, and Michael points these out with this. Some of the purists think that breeding the white rhino outside of their native conditions could lead to all sorts of genetic evolutionary changes that might not be to the species' best advantage, but who knows. The other thing that Michael talks about is CITES, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. And Michael, in fact, is engaged with the South African government trying to formulate their position on the CITES agreement, this international agreement. Because what's happening, of course, is that CITES stops the trade of rhino. And Michael points out that there are, in fact, many people in South Africa who are currently growing cattle would like to grow rhino so that they can harvest the horns, which can be done just like clipping your fingernails, and sell that into the Chinese market for big money. But of course, CITES stops that happening at the moment. What we saw, and you saw it in the press last week, these huge piles of elephant ivory being burnt in Kenya as a statement to say we will not allow trade in products of these endangered species. We will stop the trade. The question Michael raises is, does that really happen? Right, so stop the trade is the hashtag there. And these huge piles of ivory worth millions and millions of dollars. The question Michael raises is, does this impact on the supply of ivory in the black market actually cause the price of ivory to go through the roof? And of course, in turn, cause a greater stimulus to the poaching industry, because it just means that the ivory is worth much, much more. So the elephants standing out there in the wild are worth a lot more, and the poachers are willing to take much more risk in order to harvest the ivory. So I think that's a very good question that we have to ask. In fact, there's even some story at the moment that some entrepreneurs are trying to set up rhino farms in Western China. Because you can sell rhino horn within a country. Nothing to stop that. CITES doesn't stop you doing that. So if you grew rhino in China for the Chinese market, you don't have to worry about the CITES convention. And I also understand that there's a group of enviropreneurs who currently have an application to grow rhino wild in central Queensland, in outback Queensland, waiting for the CITES regulations to be relaxed to enable trade, international trade in the horn. There's one thing for sure, you're not going to stop the Chinese wanting it. All of the publicity in the world, all of the guilt trips that the West has tried to put onto Chinese traditional medicine purveyors just has had no impact. And I think the same is true of ivory too. Okay, so that's the trade in biodiversity. The next concept I want you to think about, which we touch on in the book, is the so-called notion of piggybacking. So this is where you have environmental public goods being provided alongside commercial, good property rights established private goods. And there's a couple of nice little examples in the book. Open space with housing. So you buy a house, but the deal is that you get access to open space, private open space. But that open space comes with very carefully managed biodiversity. So if you're rich enough to want to live in an estate, you buy a house in an estate that has these tracts of biodiverse country. Another lovely one is biodiversity with a burial plot. Right, so instead of just going to a cemetery, not a cemetery, it's grass with patches of plots. Okay, here you have your probably organic cardboard coffin being buried in a cemetery, which is in fact a biodiverse area. So you set aside a couple of 100 hectares as a wildlife reserve, and it's being funded by people wanting to die there. Okay, we've got a Wendy Umberger chapter with colleagues from University of Alberta on food and how the labelling of food can be a way in which consumers reflect their personal preferences for the way in which the food is produced, perhaps without impact on species that might be bycatch in ocean circumstances or without polluting chemicals being used. We've got chapters on forests with Luca Tacconi, talking about voluntary certification of timber products in order to provide this piggybacking effect, right, the private good alongside some public good. And Ken Willis has written a nice chapter which talks about heritage properties and cultural assets being set aside under the stimulus of both the owner of the cultural asset, but also perhaps visitors to the cultural asset. So mobilising demand. Remember what I said about the enviropreneur, looking for opportunities to make money out of these environmental circumstances. And just to illustrate that, there's a few photos here. Does anyone know where that is? It's one of Tasmania's biggest tourist attractions now. It's Mona, the Museum of New Art. Now, I went there. Do you know how much I paid to get in there? $50. That's what you pay. Tasmanians get in for free, which I thought was really discriminatory. I didn't have two heads, so I couldn't. Sorry, that's very and of course, lovely heritage properties that people like to buy for their own purpose, but gives passers-by the lovely experience. Mona, by the way, if you do get the chance to go there, is really interesting. I don't know if I'd pay $50 again to go in, but some pretty confronting artwork there. Forest standard certification, bird-friendly food, okay, and this non-GMO story. So all of these are examples of the ways in which markets are now starting to take advantage of this public-private coordination, or piggybacking as I like to call it. Okay, so the contribution that I've made to the book is on protected area, private sector provision of protected areas. And here you have aspects of the good which are private, but there's a big dose of altruism going on here too, people wanting to do good for others. The examples of Bush Heritage Australia and Australian Wildlife Conservancy, both of these organisations are not-for-profit. They basically fund themselves with donations from the mums and dads of Australia and some corporate donations as well. And together they own over 4 million hectares of protected areas in Australia. So it's not nearly as big as the state of the national parks of Australia, that estate, but it's a substantial chunk of land that's now in private hands, dedicated specifically for conservation purposes and covenanted to that effect. Asset value of 110 million. So don't get me wrong though, I'm not saying that these organisations are pure private, because we shouldn't fool ourselves that they are. The first thing you have to recognise is that both of these organisations, if you donate to them, you can claim a tax deduction. And that's probably one of the chief motives of many donors to these organisations. So there's that contribution being made by governments, in this case the federal government, to the operation of these organisations. But also, particularly Australian Wildlife Conservancy, relies heavily on matching grants. So if Australian Wildlife Conservancy says, right, we have targeted a property that's come onto the market and it turns out that this is a wonderful habitat for the purple-toed sloth or some equivalent in Australia, then they'll target that property and they'll go out to the public and say, we're raising money to buy this land. And for every dollar you chip in for this purchase, the government has promised us $1. So people are feeling, well, gee, I get a tax deduction here, and I know that the government's also going to chip in $1. So I'm getting twice as much value, or maybe even 3 times as much value for my $1 donated than I would if I was doing it myself. So there's some pretty strong incentives there. If you have a desire to perhaps see the that the area of protected lands in Australia grow, knowing that most state and federal governments, and the federal government have said there will be no more national parks. I mean, most governments have come out now and said we have enough of these things. State governments are saying we don't have the budget to look after the estate that we have already. So, if you want more, then you're going to have to put your hand in your pocket and do it yourself through these organisations. And these organisations not only buy the land, but they also manage the land out of these donations from the public. So quite a change over the last couple of decades in the way things happen. You can see that it's not particularly focused on any one region in Australia. The estate is widespread. Australian Wildlife Conservancy, I've just forgotten the name of the guy who started, but he was a West Australian businessman who started that. Bush Heritage Australia was started by Bob Brown, who you all know, I'm sure. He won a conservation prize for his efforts in the Tasmanian Dams situation and donated that money into start Bush Heritage Australia. So there's a widespread estate now in private hands, and I always use this as an example of free riding behaviour in my classes. I ask my very highly environmentally motivated students how many have donated to these causes, and maybe out of a class of 100 you'll get 1 or 2 people putting their hands up, but they're there. And as I said, corporate donations are pretty big with Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Okay. The other thing that I think is really quite interesting here in terms of potential for Australia is not ownership of protected areas, but management of protected areas in the private sector. And the example that I use to illustrate that isn't Australian, it's American. This company called Recreation Resource Management, Inc. It's going to be Australia if it's got an Inc. at the end. It's got to be American if it's got Inc. at the end. This is a profit-motivated company. It's a commercial company that basically has got agreements, contracts with the US Forest Service to manage recreational areas within US Forest Service land. So the US Forest Service is responsible for not just production forest, but also for recreational forest. And many of these Forest Service lands that were set up as camping areas, recreational sites, were being closed down because the Forest Service didn't have the budget to keep them open. And of course, if they're open, you know what the litigious American public is like. The government has all sorts of risks if there's no one there. There's more suits possible. So what the Recreation Resource Management did with the Forest Service is to establish contracts for this organisation to manage some of the recreational facilities on behalf of the US Forest Service. And they've been doing very nicely out of it. They've reopened many of the Forest Service sites that were closed, and what they've been able to do is to generate a profit from that. And the question is, how can this organisation make a profit where the US Forest Service was making this horrific loss to the point where they're having to close places down? And the answer really is in cost savings. The cost structure of recreation resource management is much, much lower than the cost structure of the state, of the US Forest Service, particularly in labour. Now, just think about it for a minute. US Forest Service managing these recreational zones, what they're doing is employing full-time civil servants to manage these sites. The US Forest Service is a very desirable place to work. So people want to work outside, you know, maybe put on the flannelette shirt and be a lumberjack, etc., working outside all day. Lots of people want to do it, so it's very competitive to get in, so people train up big time to get in. So you've got a lot of PhDs in ecology working in the US Forest Service. And because it's a civil service, you get your pay according to your qualifications. And so the sorts of people who were out there cleaning the toilets, picking up the rubbish, keeping the trails free to a high-paid, highly educated staff. Okay, what did Recreation Resource Management do? They started to advertise. Come and manage a recreational site for the summer holiday. We'll let you stay there for free. Bring your RV, your recreational vehicle, and park it in this spot for a couple of months. We'll let you stay there for free if you clean the toilets, keep the tracks clear, empty the rubbish. And who does it? Lots of people want to do that. Who are they? Old people. Retirees who have a zero opportunity cost of their time. They love doing this. This is their ideal. They move out of their home, get in their RV, drive across the country, from Maine down to Colorado, and stay there for the summer. They think it's a great holiday. They get paid nothing.
What happened to the PhDs in ecology? Are they now unemployed?
The PhDs in ecology, there's sure to be some attrition in that area. But my interview with the guy who runs recreation management said that the Forest Service actually likes it. The PhDs in ecology like it because they don't have to clean the toilets, empty the garbage bins. They're now doing what they think is appropriate to their task, which is managing the wildlife, managing the fire strategies, etc., for the Forest Service. So I'm not saying there's been no job loss, but people that are still there are doing jobs that they like doing and feel appropriately qualified for. Yeah. You've got to remember that these areas were closed down otherwise, so maybe the job losses had already taken place. I don't know that, I'm just thinking on the spot. So this is the, not the stars and stripes, but the gold stars, the places where Recreation Resource Management now has here's a picture of two old people who are still sufficiently able to dress up like pseudo park rangers and go out and clean the toilets. And you can see here, this is a sign that says Recreation Resource Management is managing this for the USDA Forest Service. Okay, how am I going? A few minutes yet? Sorry, I get excited about these things. It goes to water as well, not just land. Now, in the Murray-Darling Basin, we now have property rights being vested over water, and tradable property rights, free from encumbrance with land title. And so there is now potential for environmental trade in water resources. My personal view is I think we've monopolised environmental water too much. We've got this Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder that's acting like a monopolist in terms of allocating resources. I think there are great opportunities for some of the holdings of water to be diversified across the catchment, put in the hands of local trusts, right, to manage these things. There you can have prioritisation of resource use through competition amongst local, and of course a lot lower cost structure of managing these things and much faster response time. You don't have to, if there's a bird breeding event, we need another week of water in this wetland to maintain the bird breeding event. Hang on, I'll call up Canberra. Uh-oh, am I going to get this within a week? No, it's going to be, how many stamps do you need? It's going to take a lot longer and probably the birds have gone. And this is what I talk about crowding out. A lot of these little trusts were starting to emerge before the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder came on the scene. There were trusts in place that were buying water for wetlands, for watering river red gum forests. They went out of business as soon as the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder came along. Why? Because the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder just gobbled up the market. Right? They became the big purchaser. So this is the notion of crowding out. But it's starting to emerge. I don't know whether any of you saw this piece in The Australian a couple of weeks ago. This is a story about a billionaire family with the NAB starting to buy up water entitlements in the standard market, using those water entitlements on occasion for irrigated agriculture, but in times when they weren't engaged in irrigated agriculture, they were allocating their water entitlements to managing local wetlands. Now it's starting to emerge through NAB and ANZ and other banks that you're starting to get these green bonds emerging, where people will invest in buying up green bonds to do things like this. Right? You invest in green bonds to buy water. Part of the return you get is in terms of the value you get as a rate of return for the irrigated agriculture, but there's another aspect too, and that's the environmental return that a holder of a green bond gets. And the banks are cashing in on this. They're starting to put together portfolios now of assets that they can market as green bonds. And you've got these sort of particularly environmentally conscious families and individual entrepreneurs who are particularly targeting that sort of thing. Okay. PES schemes. And Marit is working with us on a scheme in Laos where we're acting as the enviropreneurs, trying to bring together those who have a demand for biodiversity with those who have the potential for supplying that biodiversity. So we're trying to, as much as possible, mimic the market processes by looking at the strength of demand and trying to free or liberate some funds from people who have a demand for biodiversity and linking that source of funds through to those people who are able to supply the biodiversity. And Anthea Coggan, some of you may know Anthea, she's been working on this concept as well, trying to use the concept of a broker to handle the transaction costs that are inherent in dealing with the knowledge problem, bringing buyers and sellers together. How can brokers work to lower the costs of gathering information so that buyers and sellers can more closely come together? So I'm not going to go into that in much detail because I want you to write that down. That's the website of the project's web page, and these are some of the photos of the areas that we're working with. Along the border between Vietnam and Laos, where there's a lot of poaching of species that are now very much in the endangered category in the IUCN Red Book. Illegal activity, illegal but unenforced. And what we're trying to do is to pay local people to engage in patrols to destroy the little wire loops that the poachers use to catch the snares that they use to catch the animals. The animals are sold into Vietnam and then up into China for the medicinal market. Okay, so I'm trying to hold this to 40 minutes or so that we can engage in some discussion. But what I want to do now is just leave you with some takeaway messages. The first point is that it's well known that decentralised market processes are just wonderful at bringing buyers together with the sellers in a way that generates a lot of information. The market process is really one of information dissemination. Prices send signals. People voluntarily in markets provide information about their costs of production and the strength of their demand. It's a wonderful asset, a wonderful advantage of the market process. And what the thinking of this book really is, why can't we take more advantage of that information creation and dissemination process? Mutual beneficiaries, that's the other key notion about markets. Markets are not, it's not regulated, it's not forced. There's no big brother coming down to say, you must go and buy this, you must go and sell that. It's mutually beneficial. So the incentives line up. Right? People work together for mutual advantage. So again, you've got information from markets and you've got good incentive structures from markets. So let's try and use those two really strong assets of a decentralised market-based system to work towards environmental protection. And as I say, ignoring the possibility just means that we've got lots and lots of cost savings, like those recreation resource management cost savings that are mutually advantageous. Another good one about that, the US Forest Service management things, incentives. The people, the old folks who are there in their RVs, they welcome people to these recreation sites, these camping sites. Welcome, come and have a cup of tea with us, or a cup of coffee. And they'll chat and say, this is great, this is what's paying my bills, so I'm happy to be a host. What happens in Australian national parks is frequently the opposite.
It's not quite fair. They're a volunteer doing it in West Australia.
Yeah, in fact, I was in Freycinet National Park, and lo and behold, I got to a hut, and there were a couple of volunteers there. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I'm saying there's a lot more that could be done. And one of the classic problems with national parks is, of course, if you go there as a visitor and you go to the toilet and you use the rubbish bins, then you're making more work for the people who don't want to be cleaning toilets and picking up the rubbish. So the incentive structure is very different. So that's important. And the other thing is that don't forget the risks that you face when you rely on government processes here. Don't forget the risks that you find in terms of being exposed to the lobby groups, the vested interests who are out there to rent seek and take advantage of the